Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some kids seem to breeze through school while others face a constant uphill battle, especially when you consider all the different parts of who they are? Today, we're diving into a fascinating study that looked at a huge amount of data from students all over the world to understand something called intersectional educational inequality. Basically, it's about how different parts of a student's identity, like their gender, their family's money situation, and where their family comes from, all mix together to affect their success in school. Think about it, we often hear that boys do better or worse than girls in certain subjects, or that kids from poorer families struggle more. But what happens when you're a girl from a low-income family with immigrant parents? Does that combine their challenges in a unique way? This study tried to find out by crunching numbers from over 537,000 students across 8 countries over 20 years. They wanted to see if inequalities were just added up from each category, or if there were totally new disadvantages or advantages that popped up because of how these categories mixed. Our school years are super important, right? Getting good at reading, math, and science sets us up for so much later in life. But sadly, not everyone has the same starting line or the same path. We know that things like family income matter a lot, but the researchers here say that it's not just one thing like money, it's how all these separate pieces of who we are, like gender, socioeconomic status, or immigrant background, come together. They call this intersectionality. It's like if you're trying to understand someone's experience, you can't just look at their gender alone or their money situation alone. You have to see how those things overlap and create a unique experience. So how did they tackle such a massive question? They used some really smart math tools borrowed from studies about health inequalities and applied them to giant international education tests called PISA tests. These tests collect data from 15-year-olds every few years in tons of countries. They looked at reading, mathematics, and science scores from Australia, Brazil, Finland, Germany, Hong Kong, Italy, Israel, and the United States from the year 2000 all the way up to 2022. This gave them a 20-year window to see how things changed. They basically divided students into a bunch of different groups based on combinations of 3 big factors: gender, 2 different measures of socioeconomic status, which included parental education and job status, and whether they had an immigrant background. This created up to 40 different intersectional groups for each country. Then they used fancy statistical models to see how much of the difference in test scores was due to these combined groups. Now, for the exciting part, what did they find? In the first big analysis, they looked at how much of the total difference in student scores was explained by these combined social groups. They found that these intersectional groups explained a pretty significant chunk of the differences in reading scores, up to 30% in some countries. That's a big deal. It means that just knowing someone's gender, their family's money situation, and their immigrant background gives you a pretty good idea of how they might perform. But here is where it gets really interesting. After they accounted for the individual effects of gender, socioeconomic status, and immigrant background separately, they looked at what was left. This is where they could see if there were unique advantages or disadvantages just because of the mix of these categories. They called this the adjusted VPC. And here is the key finding: for most countries, this adjusted proportion was quite small. It suggests that in many places, the differences in achievement were mostly due to the additive effects of these categories, rather than totally new intersection. Specific effects: for example, in Germany, Finland, Italy, the US, and Australia, these intersectional interaction effects were less than 1.5%. However, there were some notable exceptions. Brazil stood out for having significantly stronger intersection-specific inequalities. In Brazil, even after accounting for individual factors, the mix of categories explained a more substantial part of the achievement differences. They also found that the overall gaps between the highest and lowest performing intersectional groups could be enormous, at times reaching over 10 school years of learning. Imagine that a difference of an entire decade of schooling between 2 groups of students. Looking at the actual achievement patterns revealed some clear trends. Across most countries, the students who consistently scored the lowest were often boys from low socioeconomic backgrounds. The highest scoring groups were typically girls from high socioeconomic backgrounds. But the details varied. For example, in some countries, the immigrant background status of these lowest or highest performing groups mattered differently. In Germany, Finland, and Italy, for instance, being from an immigrant background was more often linked to lower achievement in the lowest performing groups. In contrast, in countries like Australia, Hong Kong, and Israel, students without an immigrant background were more represented in those lowest performing groups. The researchers also dug deeper to see if any specific combinations of characteristics led to students performing better or worse than expected based just on their individual categories. They found some fascinating patterns. For instance, in Israel, boys without an immigrant background whose highly educated parents had lower status jobs consistently performed below what was expected. This might suggest a kind of status inconsistency where high education doesn't quite match occupational prestige. In Brazil, a similar pattern of underperformance was seen in girls without immigrant backgrounds whose parents had high-status jobs but lacked higher education. On the flip side, some groups showed consistent advantages. Boys without immigrant backgrounds with highly educated parents in high-status jobs often outperformed expectations, particularly in Brazil, Israel, and Italy. These findings highlight that it's not always a simple story of adding up disadvantages. Sometimes the way things combine creates unique outcomes. So what does all this mean? The study confirms that when you look at the intersection of multiple social categories, it explains a good chunk of student achievement differences. However, for most countries, the biggest driver of these differences seems to be the straightforward stacking up of advantages and disadvantages from each category individually, rather than totally new effects emerging from their combination. But the exceptions, like Brazil having stronger intersection-specific inequalities, are really important to note. These findings suggest that while additive effects are dominant in many places, understanding these group intersections is still crucial for pinpointing where and how disparities emerge. The sheer scale of the achievement gaps they found between the top and bottom performing groups is staggering, reaching over 10 school years. This highlights the immense challenge of creating truly equitable education systems. The analysis of specific intersectional deviations also offers valuable insights. It points to potential mismatches, say, between parental education and occupational status, which can lead to unexpected outcomes for students. This adds a layer of nuance beyond simply looking at CES as one big category. Now, no study is perfect. One limitation they mention is that in many European countries, the term immigrant background often covers ethnic and cultural minority status, while in the US, race and ethnicity are more commonly used and are often tied to marginalization. They did a separate analysis for the US using race ethnicity and found some descriptive differences, but they weren't statistically significant. Also, the data they used is from PISA, which focuses on 15-year-olds, so it doesn't tell us about younger or older students. And of course, the data covers a specific set of countries, so we can't generalize these exact findings to every country in the world. They also noted that they didn't find significant differences in inequality proportions before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, which is interesting given the widespread discussions about pandemic-related learning losses. Overall, this research gives us a much clearer picture of the complex landscape of educational inequality. It emphasizes that simply looking at one factor isn't enough. We need to consider how gender, socioeconomic status, and immigrant background interact to shape educational experiences and outcomes. The massive achievement gaps and the subtle but persistent intersectional effects they uncovered underscore the urgent need for policies that address these compounded disparities. It's a call to action to move beyond simple solutions and embrace the complexity of intersectionality in our pursuit of educational equity. This research is a powerful reminder that understanding the unique experiences of students at the intersection of multiple social categories is key to a fairer future for all. Thanks for joining me on RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments what other research topics you'd like us to explore. See you next time.